March 1967. Phuoc Tuy Province. 4 shadows move through jungle so dense the canopy blocks the sun. No sound. No radio chatter. No cigarettes. Just breathing, and the wet heat pressing down like a hand over the mouth. They stop. The lead man kneels. His fingers trace a depression in the mud, barely visible, already filling with seepage from the jungle floor. A boot print. Not American. Not Australian. Enemy. And if you're watching this, you need to subscribe to Vietnam War Records right now, because what you're about to hear is the true story of how a handful of soldiers turned the jungle itself into a weapon that terrified one of the most experienced guerrilla armies in history. The print is 6 hours old, maybe 7. The edges have softened but not collapsed. Moisture still clings to the deepest part of the impression where the heel pressed down. The tracker runs his thumb along the rim. He doesn't need to speak. The other 3 men read his body language like a language learned in blood. They know what he knows. Someone walked here in the dark. Someone carrying weight. Someone who stumbled slightly because there's a scuff mark 3 inches to the left where the boot dragged. Someone tired. Someone human. Someone they're going to find. This is not how the Americans fought the Vietnam War. This is something else entirely. Something older. Something that reached back through decades of colonial bush warfare, through the Malayan emergency, through Aboriginal hunters who tracked kangaroo across desert for 50,000 years, and brought it all forward into the green hell of Southeast Asia, where it collided with an enemy who thought they owned the jungle. They were wrong. The Australian SAS arrived in Vietnam in February 1966, and from the first patrol, they operated like ghosts. 4-man teams, sometimes 5 or 6, never more. They would insert by helicopter at last light, drop into the canopy, and disappear for 2 weeks. No resupply, no radio checks unless they found something worth killing. They carried everything on their backs. Rations that didn't require cooking, water purification tablets, ammunition taped and wrapped so nothing rattled. They moved in single file with 10 meters between each man, so a single burst of fire couldn't take the whole patrol. They used hand signals developed in the jungles of Borneo and Malaya, refined over years of hunting communist insurgents who melted into the trees like smoke. The lead scout was the tracker. Behind him, the patrol commander. Then the signaler carrying the radio. Then the tail end Charlie watching their rear, walking backward every 10th step, checking for followers. They didn't wear aftershave. They didn't use soap that smelled like anything other than mud. They didn't smoke. They didn't talk. After a week in the bush, they stopped smelling human. They smelled like the jungle. Damp earth, rotting vegetation, the sweet decay of a forest that never stops eating itself. The Americans fought differently. They came in battalions, 500 men, 1,000 men. They established fire support bases with artillery and mortars. They flew in supplies by helicopter every day, hot food, cold beer sometimes, mail from home. They built bunkers and strung concertina wire and filled sandbags and conducted patrols out from the perimeter and came back before dark. When they made contact with the enemy, they called in gunships and fast movers and laid down walls of fire that turned the jungle into a moonscape. It was industrial warfare, overwhelming force, American firepower against communist ideology. And it didn't work. It didn't work because the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army had been fighting in this jungle for 20 years. They knew every trail, every water source, every cave and tunnel and hiding place. They knew how to move without being seen. They knew how to ambush a column and disappear before the artillery could be called in. They knew the jungle wasn't just terrain, it was an ally. It fed them. It hid them. It swallowed their enemies. But then the Australians came, and the equation changed. The Australians had learned their trade in Malaya from 1948 to 1960, fighting Chinese communist guerrillas in jungle even thicker than Vietnam. The British SAS had developed a doctrine called hearts and minds, but the tactical side was pure hunter-killer. Small patrols, long duration. Live in the jungle. Become part of it. Track the enemy not with dogs or technology, but with your eyes and your brain. Obedience and your patience. The Australians absorbed this. They made it their own. And when some of the Australian infantry battalions deployed Aboriginal soldiers from the outback, men whose grandfathers had tracked game across the Pilbara and Arnhem Land using skills passed down since the Dreamtime, the tracking capability reached a level the Americans couldn't comprehend. These Aboriginal trackers could look at bent grass and tell you how many men had passed and how long ago. They could see a broken spider web and know someone had walked through it in the last 2 hours because the spider hadn't repaired it yet. They could smell water on the wind and lead a patrol to a stream marked on no map. They could touch the ash of a cooking fire and tell you whether it was 1 hour old or 3. Some of them were attached to regular infantry battalions. Others worked with advisors in the Australian Army training team. Their knowledge filtered through the entire Australian task force, It became part of the culture. Every digger learned something. Every SAS trooper learned more. By 1967, the Australian SAS was conducting reconnaissance patrols in Phuoc Tuy Province that were surgical in their precision. They would insert into an area the size of a few square kilometers and spend 10 days just watching. They'd find a trail, set up an observation post, count every person who walked past, note the weapons, the uniforms, the direction of travel, the time of day. They built a picture, a pattern, and when the pattern was clear, they set an ambush. The ambush was an art form. The killing ground had to be small, 10 meters, maybe 15, close enough that every shot counted. They positioned themselves in an L shape so their fire interlocked and nobody shot into their own people. They used claymore mines daisy-chained together. They sighted their rifles on specific points on the trail, marked with tiny scratches on trees or stones they'd memorized. Then they waited, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, motionless. Insects crawling over their faces, leeches working into their skin, heat and humidity and the suffocating pressure of absolute stillness. When the enemy walked into the killing ground, the patrol commander would initiate with a single shot or a detonated claymore. Then everyone fired, disciplined, semi-automatic, aimed shots, not the wild spray of an M16 on full auto. Each round placed with precision. The ambush lasted 10 seconds, maybe 15. Then silence. The Australians would check the bodies, take documents, take weapons if they could carry them. Then they'd disappear. Not along the trail, not back the way they came. They'd move perpendicular into the thickest jungle and go to ground, sometimes within 100 meters of the ambush site. They'd listen. The enemy would come. Reinforcements. Angry, confused, looking for the attackers. They'd search the area, sometimes for hours, and the Australians would be right there, frozen, barely breathing, listening to the enemy walk past them in the dark. This psychological dimension was as important as the killing. The Viet Cong and NVA began to realize they were being hunted by something they couldn't see. Trails that had been safe for years suddenly weren't. Supply routes got ambushed. Couriers disappeared. Camps were discovered and destroyed by artillery, called in from observation posts they never knew existed. The enemy started to feel what the Australians wanted them to feel: fear, uncertainty, the creeping realization that the jungle wasn't theirs anymore. Captured documents from 1967 show this clearly. A Viet Cong intelligence report warned cadres about Australian patrols, describing them as phantoms who track like hunters. Another document from the NVA's D445 battalion, the main enemy force in Phuoc Tuy, noted that Australian patrols are small but deadly and that they ambush our supply routes and vanish. A VC political officer wrote in his diary, recovered after a battle, that the Australians are different from the Americans. They do not make noise. We do not hear them until they shoot. This was the difference. The Americans wanted the enemy to know they were there. Loudspeakers on helicopters, leaflets dropped from planes, psychological operations designed to intimidate. The Australians wanted the opposite. They wanted the enemy to feel alone, to feel watched, to walk down a trail and wonder if every shadow held a rifle. The tracking was the foundation of everything. An SAS patrol in the Long High Hills, a VC stronghold east of the main Australian base at Nui Dat, once followed a trail for 6 days. They'd found boot prints at a stream crossing. The prints were 3 days old, already fading, but the lead scout could still read them. 5 individuals, 4 wearing Ho Chi Minh sandals made from tire rubber, 1 wearing boots, probably an NVA advisor or a senior cadre. They were heading northeast toward the coast, which meant they were likely moving supplies from a cache to an inland unit. The patrol followed, not directly on the trail. That would be suicide. They paralleled it, moving slowly through the scrub, stopping every few minutes to listen. The jungle has a rhythm. Birds, insects, monkeys crashing through the canopy. When that rhythm breaks, something's wrong. They listened for silence. Silence meant humans. Humans meant enemy. On the 4th day, they smelled smoke. Faint. Just a trace on the wind. They stopped. The patrol commander made a fist, the signal to freeze. They waited. 10 minutes, 20. The smell grew slightly stronger. Cooking fire, maybe 400 meters ahead. They moved forward in a crouch, pausing after every step to listen. 50 meters, 100. Then they heard voices, Vietnamese. Low conversation. Someone laughed. The patrol went to ground. They didn't advance further. Not yet. They set up an observation post in a thicket of bamboo that gave them a narrow sight line toward the sound. They watched for 3 hours. Finally, through a gap in the vegetation, they saw movement. A small camp. 6 VC, shelters made from ponchos. Cooking pots, rifles stacked against a tree, AK-47s, 1 RPG. This wasn't a patrol. This was a way station, a stopover point for resupply columns moving through the area. The Australians didn't attack. 6 enemies weren't worth compromising their position. Instead, they radioed coordinates back to headquarters. Then, they repositioned. They moved 300 meters east to a trail junction they'd crossed earlier. If the VC were camped where they were, they'd eventually leave. And when they left, they'd use the trail. The junction was the perfect ambush site. They waited 2 more days. On the 6th day, just after dawn, the VC broke camp. The Australians heard them coming. The creak of equipment, the shuffle of boots on dirt. They tensed. Fingers on triggers, safety off. The first VC walked into the killing ground. Then the second, third, fourth. The patrol commander was counting. He waited. 5th, 6th. All of them in the zone. He squeezed his trigger. The roar of the ambush shattered the jungle silence. Claymores detonated. Rifles cracked. The VC didn't have time to react. In 12 seconds, it was over. 6 enemy dead. The Australians moved through the killing ground, grabbed documents from the bodies. A notebook, a map. Then they were gone. Melting back into the jungle. 20 minutes later, they heard the enemy reinforcements arrive. Shouting. Confusion. The Australians were 200 meters away, hidden in a drainage ditch, covered in mud and leaves, listening. The enemy searched for an hour. Found. Nothing. Left. That patrol was typical. Not extraordinary. Just another mission in a year of missions. The Australians conducted over 1,200 patrols like that during their time in Vietnam. They killed 492 confirmed enemy. They lost 2 men in combat. 2. The casualty ratio was obscene. It demonstrated a level of tactical proficiency that bordered on the supernatural. But it wasn't supernatural. It was skill, and it was built on a foundation of tracking that the Americans never fully understood. The U.S. military had trackers. They used scout dogs. German shepherds and Labradors trained to detect human scent. The dogs were effective in open terrain but struggled in the jungle where the humidity and the density of smells overwhelmed them. The Americans also used Kit Carson scouts, former Viet Cong who'd defected and now worked for the South Vietnamese and U.S. forces. These scouts were invaluable. They knew the enemy's tactics. They could read the jungle. But there were never enough of them and they were always viewed with suspicion. Could you really trust a man who'd been trying to kill you last year? The Australians didn't have those problems. Every SAS trooper was trained in tracking, not as a specialty, as a basic skill. During selection, candidates were taken into the Queensland rainforest and taught to read sign. They learned to identify the difference between a footprint made that morning and one made yesterday. They learned that a broken twig bent downward means someone pushed through recently, while a twig bent upward and dried means it was broken days ago and has been moved by wind or animals. They learned to look for compressed vegetation, scuff marks on roots, discoloration on stones where mud had been transferred from a boot. This wasn't exotic knowledge. It was fieldcraft. The same skills a hunter uses to track deer, but applied with military discipline and combined with tactical sophistication, it became lethal. An SAS patrol could find a boot print, determine it was 4 hours old, backtrack it to find where the enemy had come from, then forward track it to predict where they were going. They could identify whether the person was carrying a load by the depth of the print. They could estimate the size of the group by the number of distinct prints and the width of the disturbed area. They could tell if the group was moving cautiously or casually by the spacing and the depth variation of the steps. The NVA and VC knew about tracking too. They were masters of camouflage and counter-tracking. They walked in streams to avoid leaving prints. They brushed out their footprints with branches. They laid false trails. They walked backward in their own footprints to confuse trackers. But the Australians adapted. If a trail disappeared into a stream, they'd move upstream and downstream looking for the exit point. If footprints suddenly stopped, they'd search in widening circles looking for where the trail resumed. If a trail seemed too obvious, they'd assume it was a decoy and look for the real trail nearby. One of the Aboriginal trackers serving with the Australian infantry, a soldier named Billy Coolborough, was legendary. He once tracked a VC courier for 11 kilometers through jungle and swamp after finding a single footprint at a river crossing. The print was 2 days old. Most soldiers would have dismissed it. Coolborough saw something in the pattern of the tread, a distinctive wear mark on the heel, and he followed it. He led his platoon through terrain so thick they had to cut their way with machetes. He lost the trail 3 times and found it again each time. Finally, they found the courier's camp. The man was asleep under a poncho. They captured him alive. He was carrying maps and documents that led to the discovery of a major supply cache. Stories like that spread, not just among the Australians, but among the enemy. The VC started to avoid areas where Australian trackers operated. They changed their routes. They increased their security. They began leaving sentries on trails to watch for followers. But that slowed them down, made them less efficient. which was exactly what the Australians wanted. The psychological pressure was immense. Imagine you're a Viet Cong fighter. You've been living in the jungle for months, maybe years. You know this area. You've walked these trails 100 times. You know where the Americans patrol. You know their patterns. They're loud. They're predictable. You can hear their helicopters from kilometers away. You can smell their cigarettes. You can avoid them, but then you hear about a patrol that disappeared, just gone, found dead in an ambush 2 days later, their bodies already starting to rot in the heat. No one heard the gunfire. No one saw the attackers. Or you're walking a trail at night and you get the feeling you're being watched. You stop. Listen. Nothing. But the feeling doesn't go away. You keep walking. Faster now. And that night you can't sleep because you keep thinking about the stories. The Australians who move like ghosts. Who can follow a trail days old. Who set ambushes and vanish. That fear was a weapon. It degraded enemy morale. It made them hesitant. And hesitation in combat gets you killed. The Australians understood this because they'd learned it in Malaya. During the Malayan emergency, the British and Commonwealth forces had fought communist guerrillas for 12 years in jungle even denser than Vietnam. The guerrillas had support from the Chinese population in the rural areas. They had supply lines. They had sanctuary. They should have won. But the British developed a strategy called Hearts and Minds, which combined civic action to win over the population with aggressive small unit patrolling to hunt down the guerrillas. The SAS was reformed specifically for this campaign. They perfected the art of long-range reconnaissance. 4-man patrols living in the jungle for weeks, sometimes months, tracking guerrilla bands and either ambushing them or calling in larger forces to destroy them. The Australians rotated units through Malaya as part of the Commonwealth commitment. They absorbed the lessons. When the war ended in 1960 with a British victory, those lessons were institutionalized. The Australian SAS was formed in 1957, modeled directly on the British SAS. The training was brutal. The selection course had a 50% failure rate. The men who passed were quiet professionals. Not cowboys, not glory seekers. They were patient, methodical, comfortable with discomfort. When they arrived in Vietnam, they brought that ethos with them, and they brought something else, a respect for the enemy. The Australians didn't hate the Viet Cong. They didn't dehumanize them. They understood that the VC were fighters defending their country as they saw it. Misguided? Maybe. Ideologically opposed. But not subhuman. Not savages. This respect made the Australians more effective because they studied the enemy. They learned their tactics. They anticipated their moves. They thought like them. The Americans often didn't have that respect. Not all Americans, of course. Many did. But the institutional culture was different. The U.S. military in Vietnam was a conscript army. Most soldiers didn't want to be there. They did their tour and went home. The Australians were volunteers, professional soldiers, lifers. They wanted to be there, not because they loved war, but because war was their job and they wanted to do it well. This professionalism showed in everything. The Australians didn't have the drug problems the Americans had. They didn't have the racial tensions. They didn't have the fragging incidents where disgruntled soldiers killed their own officers. The Australian task force at Nui Dat was tight, disciplined. When an SAS patrol came back from 2 weeks in the bush, filthy and exhausted, they'd debrief immediately. Every detail, every sighting, every track, every sound. The intelligence section would collate the reports from all the patrols and build a comprehensive picture of enemy activity. That picture would inform the next wave of patrols. It was a cycle. Continuous. Relentless. The enemy couldn't sustain operations under that pressure. The D445 VC Battalion, which had dominated Phuoc Tuy Province before the Australians arrived, was reduced to a shadow of its former strength by 1969. They couldn't move supplies. They couldn't recruit. Their fighters were exhausted and demoralized. The North Vietnamese tried to reinforce them with regular NVA units, but those units faced the same problem. The moment they entered Phuoc Tuy, they were under observation. Their trails were tracked. Their camps were found. Their movements were predicted. One NVA officer, captured in 1968, told his interrogators that operating in Phuoc Tuy was like walking through a spider's web. You couldn't see it, but you knew it was there. Every step might trigger something. An ambush, an artillery strike, a helicopter assault. The Australians had eyes everywhere, he said. Not literally, of course, but it felt that way. That feeling was the product of the tracking. Because once you found a trail, you owned it. You could watch it, ambush it, mine it, booby-trap it, or just observe it and learn from it. Where does it go? Who uses it? When? How often? That information was intelligence. And intelligence was power. The Australians also used local knowledge. They worked closely with the South Vietnamese regional and popular forces, the local militia. These men knew the villages. They knew the people. They could identify who was VC and who wasn't. The Australians combined that human intelligence with their tracking and reconnaissance, and the result was a targeting process that was devastatingly effective, but it wasn't perfect. The Australians made mistakes. Patrols got compromised. Men were wounded. The jungle was a hostile environment even without the enemy. Heat exhaustion, infected cuts, snake bites, malaria. The constant wetness rotted boots and clothes and skin. After a week in the bush, a soldier's feet would be white and swollen, the skin peeling off in sheets. Jungle rot. It was painful and debilitating. And there was always the fear. Even the best soldiers felt it. Walking point as the lead scout was the most dangerous job. You were the first man into any ambush. Your eyes had to be constantly moving. Ground, trees, bushes, shadows, looking for the telltale signs. A freshly turned leaf showing its lighter underside. A vine pulled aside and not quite fallen back into place. A footprint, a scuff mark, anything. Because if you missed it, people died. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were expert at ambushes. They'd position themselves in heavy cover along a trail. They'd let the point man pass. Then they'd open fire on the main body of the patrol, hitting the commander and the radio operator first to decapitate leadership and cut off communication. If the ambush was well executed, the patrol could be wiped out in seconds. The Australian SAS lost men that way. Not many, but each loss was felt deeply. In a four-man patrol, you lived in each other's pockets for weeks. You knew everything about them. Their habits, their fears, their stories. When someone died, it was like losing a brother. But the losses were rare. The Australians were too good, too careful. They didn't take unnecessary risks. If a situation felt wrong, they'd pull back, wait, reassess. The Americans sometimes called them cautious, overly cautious, but the Australians called it professionalism. There's a difference between bravery and stupidity. Bravery is doing the dangerous thing when it needs to be done. Stupidity is doing the dangerous thing because you're too proud or too dumb to find another way. The Australians found other ways. If a trail was too well traveled, they didn't set up on it. Too risky. The enemy would have security. Instead, they'd find a secondary trail, less traffic but still used. Ambush that. If a target was too hard, they didn't force it. They'd call in artillery or an airstrike. Let the firepower do the work. Save the patrol for another day. This pragmatism extended to their relationship with the Vietnamese population. The Australians didn't conduct the massive forced relocations the Americans did. They didn't burn villages suspected of harboring VC. They worked with the village chiefs. They provided medical care. They built schools. They understood that winning the war meant winning the people. If the people supported the government, the VC had no base, no recruits, no supplies. They'd wither. In Phuoc Tuy, this approach worked. By 1970, the province was relatively pacified. Markets operated. Roads were open. Children went to school. The VC still existed, but they were a nuisance rather than a threat. The Australians had achieved what the Americans couldn't in other provinces: stability. But it came at a cost. The Australians were exhausted. They'd been rotating units through Vietnam for 5 years. The public back in Australia was turning against the war. Protests, draft resistance. The government was under pressure. In 1971, the decision was made. Australia would withdraw. The task force packed up and left. The SAS conducted their last patrols. The trackers came home. And Phuoc Tuy fell apart. Without the Australians, the VC returned. The NVA moved in. By 1972, the province was contested again. By 1975, it was communist-controlled like the rest of the country. The Australian achievement had been tactical, not strategic. They'd won their battles, but the war was lost anyway. The veterans came home to a country that didn't want to hear about it. No parades, no recognition. The Australian public associated Vietnam with America's failure, and they wanted to forget. The SAS troopers and the infantrymen and the trackers went back to civilian life or stayed in the military and didn't talk about what they'd done, the skills they'd learned, the men they'd killed, the fear and the exhaustion and the strange pride of having done something difficult and done it well. It took decades for the story to come out, for historians to access the records, for veterans to start talking. And when they did, a picture emerged of a campaign that was tactically brilliant and strategically irrelevant. The Australian SAS in Vietnam had been the best small unit soldiers in the war, better than the US Special Forces, better than the NVA sappers, better than anyone. They'd taken the art of tracking and turned it into a science. They'd combined Aboriginal traditional knowledge with British jungle warfare doctrine and Australian improvisation and created something unique. The NVA admitted as much. In the 1990s, after relations between Australia and Vietnam normalized, some former NVA and VC officers were interviewed. One colonel who'd commanded forces in Phuoc Tuy said the Australians were the most dangerous enemy we faced. Not because of their firepower, the Americans had more firepower, but because the Australians understood the jungle. They fought like us, he said. Small units, stealth, patience, but with better training and better equipment. We respected them. We feared them. That respect was mutual. The Australians who fought in Vietnam didn't talk about the enemy as gooks or slopes or any of the dehumanizing terms common in war. They called them Charlie, the enemy. They acknowledged the VC were tough, brave, committed, and that made the Australian victory over them mean something. But the victory was hollow, because the war was lost. The communists won. The Americans left. The South Vietnamese government collapsed. And all the men who died, Australian and Vietnamese and American and everyone else, died for nothing. That's the tragedy of Vietnam. Not that soldiers didn't fight well. They did. Not that there weren't victories. There were. But that none of it mattered in the end. The tracking skills that made the Australian SAS so lethal are still taught today. The Australian Defence Force maintains the tradition. Selection courses for special operations include tracking modules, bush survival, navigation, observation, the ability to read the land and the signs humans leave on it. Those skills are timeless. They worked in Malaya. They worked in Vietnam. They worked in Afghanistan and Iraq. They'll work in whatever jungle or desert or mountain range the next war is fought in. Because tracking is about more than footprints. It's about attention, focus, the ability to see what others miss. It's about patience, the willingness to wait for hours or days for the right moment. It's about respect for the environment, understanding that nature has patterns, and when those patterns break, something's wrong. It's a hunter's skill, and soldiers, at the end of the day, are hunters. They hunt other humans. And the best hunters are the ones who can think like their prey, anticipate them, become them. The Aboriginal trackers who served in Vietnam understood this instinctively. For them, tracking wasn't a skill learned in a course. It was cultural, ancestral, passed down through generations. They brought that knowledge to the Australian military, and it spread, not just to the SAS, but to regular infantry, to reconnaissance platoons, to anyone who spent time in the bush. And it made the Australian Army better. There's a respect in Australia today for those Aboriginal servicemen, recognition that came too late for many of them. They served their country in a war that didn't value them when they came home. Aboriginal veterans faced discrimination, poverty, lack of access to services, but their contribution is remembered now. Memorials, plaques, their names recorded, their service honored, and the skills they taught are still saving lives. Australian soldiers in Afghanistan used tracking to find IED emplacers, to follow insurgent trails through the mountains, to locate enemy camps. The lessons of Vietnam translated directly to the modern battlefield, because war changes, but the fundamentals don't. If you can find your enemy before he finds you, you win. That was the lesson of the Australian SAS in Vietnam. That was the lesson the NVA learned the hard way. The jungle doesn't belong to anyone. It's neutral. But the side that can read it, that can move through it silently, that can use it as a weapon, that side has the advantage. And in Phuoc Tuy Province, from 1966 to 1971, that side was Australia. The trackers are old men now, most of them. Some have passed. They don't talk much about the war. When they do, it's not about the killing. It's about the other things, the mateship, the trust you had to have in the man next to you, the beauty of the jungle at dawn when the mist rose through the trees and everything was quiet and you felt like the only human being on earth, the satisfaction of a job done well, a trail followed to its end, an ambush perfectly executed, the knowledge that you were good at something that mattered, even if the larger cause was lost. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the meaning of service isn't in the politics or the strategy or the outcome. Maybe it's in the doing, in the professionalism, in the skill. The Australian SAS tracked the enemy through jungle that should have been impassable. They hunted men who thought they were invisible. They won battles that should have been unwinnable. They did it with courage and discipline, and a set of skills that reached back through history to the very beginning of human hunting. That's the story. That's the truth. And that's why the North Vietnamese Army, one of the most experienced and effective fighting forces of the 20th century, feared a handful of Australian soldiers who could read the jungle like a book, written in a language only they understood. If this story moved you, if you learned something, hit that subscribe button right now for Vietnam War Records. Share this video. Leave a comment with your thoughts. There are thousands of stories from Vietnam that need to be told. Stories of courage and sacrifice and skill. Stories that honor the men who fought and the complexity of the war they fought in. This channel is dedicated to preserving that history, to making sure these soldiers aren't forgotten, to understanding what happened in that jungle half a century ago, and why it still matters today. Because it does matter. The lessons matter. The sacrifices matter. The skills that turned ordinary men into lethal hunters matter, and the respect we owe to everyone who served on all sides matters most of all. Subscribe. Remember, honor the history. This is Vietnam War Records. This is the true story of the Australian SAS tracker teams who shocked the NVA with skills the Americans couldn't match. And this is just one story among thousands waiting to be told.